Right, everyone. Happy Monday. Welcome back from what was spring break. But what we are going to do today is we are going to be going through a little guided read aloud of one of my favorite books from when I was in third grade, Frindle by Andrew Clements. Frindle is an amazing novel in the fact that there is some awesome lessons to be learned about character development, setting, theme, plot structure, and a lot of the other things that we've talked a lot about during our lessons this year centered around language arts, and as well as some social studies stuff too. So what we're going to do is we're going to start a novel study. And what we're going to be doing is we are going to be doing a guided read aloud here of Frindle, and we're going to be starting and stopping at some certain points and talking about some different things that are important with the book and some things that I want you to keep in mind as we move forward with this little 2-week unit. So just real quick, here's how things are going to be kind of organized. What we're going to do is I'm going to be reading chapters 1 through 3 today. You are going to have an assignment on Google Classroom that is due on Wednesday. It's actually due Tuesday night, but let's just call it Wednesday. And then you're going to have another video and another assignment that is assigned on Wednesday, and that's due on Friday. So you're going to have 2 language arts assignments that are in Google Classroom. They involve reading, they involve writing. So it's kind of a combination of some different things there. And then you're also going to have social studies and science and math from Miss Koto. So this is going to look pretty similar to how a normal day looks. So for these first 3 chapters, I want us to sit back and let's just get to know our characters a little bit. And let's focus on who the characters are, what they're like, what are their traits, how are we similar to the characters? How are we different from the characters? And let's just kind of get our bearings for the story right off the bat. That word frindle. I'm thinking to myself, is that even a real word? Well, that's one thing that we're going to think about in these first 3 chapters. So let's begin. Chapter 1, Nick. If you ask the kids and the teachers at Lincoln Elementary School to make 3 lists, all the really bad kids, all the really smart kids, and all the really good kids, Nick Allen would not be any one of them. Nick deserved a list all to his own, and everyone knew it. Was Nick a troublemaker? Hard to say. One thing's for sure, Nick Allen had plenty of ideas, and he knew what to do with them. One time in third grade, Nick decided to turn Miss Deaver's room into a tropical island. What kid in New Hampshire isn't ready for a little summer in February? So first he got everyone to make small palm trees out of green and brown construction paper and tape them into the corners of their desks. Miss Deaver had only been a teacher for about 6 months, and she was delighted. That's so cute. The next day, all the girls wore paper flowing dresses in their hair, and all the boys wore sunglasses and beach hats. Miss Deaver clapped her hands and said, "It's so colorful." The day after that, Nick turned the classroom thermostat up about 90 degrees with a little screwdriver that he brought from home. All the kids changed into shorts and t-shirts with no shoes. And when Miss Deaver left the room for a minute, Nick spread about 10 cups of fine white sand all over the classroom. It's pretty crazy. Miss Deaver was surprised again at just how creative her students could be. But the sand got tracked out into the hallway, where Manny the custodian did not think it was creative at all, and he stomped right down to the office. The principal followed the trail of sand, and when she arrived, Miss Deaver was teaching the hula to some kids near the front of the room, and a tall, thin, shirtless boy with chestnut hair was just spiking a Nerf volleyball over a net made from t-shirts tied together. The third grade trip to the South Seas ended suddenly. Again, I'm thinking to myself, what type of character is Nick? Nick is, there's a lot that we know here about Nick, kind of who he is and kind of, things that we can infer about, what type of student he is, what his friends might think about him. And that's going to come back. So we really need to pay attention to that here. Page 3. But that didn't stop Nick from trying to liven things up. Lincoln Elementary needed a good jolt once in a while, and Nick was just the guy to deliver it. About a year later, Nick made the great blackbird discovery. One night, he learned on a TV show that red-winged blackbirds give this high-pitched chirp when a hawk or some other danger comes near. Because of the way the sound travels, the hunter birds can't tell where the high pitched chirp is coming from. The next day, during silent reading, Nick glanced at his teacher and he noticed that Mrs. Avery's nose was curved, kind of like the beak of a hawk. So Nick let out a high, squeaky blackbird. Mrs. Avery jerked her head from her book and looked around. She couldn't tell who it was. She just said, shh, to the whole class. A minute later, Nick did it again, louder. Beep! This time, there was a little giggling from the class, but Mrs. Avery pretended not to hear the sound. And about 15 seconds later, she slowly stood up and walked to the back of the classroom. Without taking his eyes off his book and without moving at all, Nick put his heart and soul into the highest, most annoying chirp of all. Beep! Mrs. Avery pronounced. Janet Fisk, you stop that this instant. Janet, who was sitting 4 rows away from Nick, promptly turned white, then bright crimson. It wasn't me, honest. Ooh, lost my thought here, sorry. There was a catch in Janet's voice, as if she was going to cry. Mrs. Avery knew she had made a mistake, and she apologized to Janet. But someone is asking for big trouble, said Mrs. Avery, looking like a hawk every second. Nick kept reading. He didn't make another peep. At lunchtime, Nick talked to Janet. He felt bad that Mrs. Avery had pounced on her. Janet lived in Nick's neighborhood, and sometimes they played together. She was good at baseball. She was better at soccer than most of the kids in the whole school, boys or girls. Nick said, Hey, Janet, I'm sorry you got yelled at during reading. It was my fault. I was the one who made the sound. You did? Said Janet. But how come Mrs. Avery thought it was me? So Nick told her about the blackbirds, and Janet thought that was pretty interesting. Then she tried to make a peep or two on her own. And Janet's chirps were even higher and squeakier than Nick's. She promised to keep everything a secret. For the rest of Nick's 4th grade year, at least once a week, Mrs. Avery heard a loud beep from somewhere in the classroom. Sometimes it was a high-pitched chirp. Sometimes it was a very high-pitched chirp. Mrs. Avery never figured out who was making the sound, and gradually she trained herself to ignore it. But she still looked like a hawk. To Nick, the whole thing was just one long and successful science experiment, and Janet Fisk enjoyed it too. And that is the end of Chapter 1. Chapter 2, Mrs. Granger. 5th grade was different. That was the year to get ready for middle school. 5th grade meant passing classes, it meant no morning recess, it meant real letter grades on your report cards, but most of all, it meant Mrs. Granger. There was about 150 kids in 5th grade, and there were 7 5th grade teachers, 2 math, 2 science, 2 social studies, but only 1 language arts teacher. In language arts, Mrs. Granger had a monopoly and a reputation. Mrs. Granger lived alone in a tidy little house in an older part of town. She drove an old pale blue car to school every single morning. Every single morning, rain or shine, snow or sleet, hail or wind. She had perfect attendance. She had a perfect attendance record, and that stretched back farther than anyone could ever remember. Her hair was almost white, swept away from her face and up into something like a nest on the back of her head. Unlike some of the younger women teachers, she never wore pants to school. She had 2 skirt and jacket outfits, her gray uniform and her blue uniform, which she always wore over a white shirt with a little cameo pin in the neck. And Mrs. Granger was one of those people who never sweats. It had to be over 90 degrees before she even took off her jacket. She was small as teachers go. There were even some 5th graders who were taller, but Mrs. Granger seemed like a giant. It was her eyes that did it. They were dark gray, and if she turned them on full power, they could make you feel like a speck of dust. Her eyes could twinkle and laugh too, and kids said she would crack funny jokes, but it wasn't the jokes that made her famous. Everyone was sure that Mrs. Granger had X-ray vision. Don't even think about chewing a piece of gum within 50 feet of her. If you did, Mrs. Granger would see you and catch you and make you stick the gum onto a bright yellow index card. Then she would safety pin the card to the front of your shirt, and you'd have to wear it for the rest of the school day. After that, you had to take it home and have your mom or dad sign the card and bring it back to Mrs. Granger the next day. And it didn't matter to Mrs. Granger if you weren't in fifth grade, because the way she saw it, sooner or later you would be. All the kids at Lincoln Elementary School knew that at the end of the line, fifth grade, Mrs. Granger would be the one grading their spelling test and their reading test, and worst of all, their vocabulary test. Week after week, month after month, every language arts teacher in the world enjoys making kids use the dictionary. Check your spelling. Check your definition. Check those syllable breaks. But Mrs. Granger didn't just enjoy the dictionary. She loved the dictionary, almost worshipped it. Her weekly vocabulary list was 35 words long, sometimes longer. As if that wasn't bad enough, there was a word of the day on the blackboard every morning. If you gave yourself a day off and didn't write one down and look it up and learn the definition, sooner or later Mrs. Granger would find out. And then, just for you, there would be 2 words of the day for a whole week. Mrs. Granger kept a full set of 30 dictionaries on a shelf at the back of the room. But her pride and joy was one of those huge dictionaries with every word in the universe in it. The kind of book that it would take 2 kids to carry. It sat on its own little table at the front of the classroom, sort of like the altar at the front of a church. Every graduate of Lincoln Elementary for the past 35 years could remember standing on the table listening to Mrs. Granger battle cry, "Look it up! That's why we have the dictionary." Even before the school year started, when it was still the summer before 5th grade for Nick and his friends, Mrs. Granger was already busy. Every parent of every new 5th grader got a letter from her. Nick's mom read the part out loud during dinner one night in August. Every home is expected to have a good dictionary in it so that every student can do his or her homework properly. Good spelling and good grammar and good word skills are essential for every student. Clear thinking requires a command of the English language, and 5th grade is the ideal time for every girl and boy to acquire an expanded vocabulary. And then there was a list of dictionaries that Mrs. Granger thought would be acceptable for home study. Mrs. Allen said, "It's so nice to have a teacher that takes her work so seriously." Nick groaned and tried to enjoy the rest of his hamburger, but even watermelon for dessert didn't cheer him up either. Nick had no particular use for a dictionary. He liked words a lot, and he was good at using them, but he figured that he got all the words he needed just by reading, and he read all the time. When Nick ran into a word he didn't know, he asked his brother or his dad or whoever was handy what it meant. And if they knew, they'd tell him. But not Mrs. Granger. He had heard all about her, and he had seen 5th graders in the library last year, noses stuck in their dictionaries, frantically trying to finish their vocabulary sheets before English class. It was still a week before school, and Nick already felt like 5th grade was going to be a very, very long year. That is the end of chapter 2. All right, so what I want us to think about real quick is we can infer a lot about Nick, and we can infer a lot about Mrs. Granger. So what we're already doing is we're starting to see these characters, and we're starting to see that Nick is smart, Nick is a little mischievous, as we saw from chapter 1, but Nick is a lot of things. And one thing that you're going to do is you are going to be tasked in your assignment this week with looking at a Venn diagram here. And we all know a Venn diagram. We compare 2 things, sometimes more, but in this case, we're going to be comparing you as a student and Nick. I'm sure every single one of us in this class can find some similarities between us and Nick. Me, as a teacher, there are definitely some similarities between me and Ms. Granger. But me and Ms. Granger aren't, obviously all the exact same. So what I want us to do is think about this. Think about inferences that we can pull from, who these characters are and what makes them unique. in kind of what Andrew Clements, the author here, is already telling us about them, and also what can we just understand a little better just by kind of looking at the way the characters act too. Again, I want to start thinking about the setting here. We're starting to think about the setting. How are things unfolding in this book? Where do we think this book is going to be taking place moving forward? Again, this is our first day with this book, so we're still really thinking just about surface level things. But as we dive more into character development and plot structure, again, we're thinking about that rising action. We're talking about, maybe what some emerging themes might be. But I hope you're all thinking about these things as we keep going into Chapter 3. And Chapter 3 is going to be our last chapter for today. But feel free to go back and watch this video because I know not all of you have Frindle at home. If you do, that's amazing. But if you need the actual text, again, it's here on YouTube. And yeah, let's start with Chapter 3. And feel free to reach out with any questions or anything like that, okay? Cool. Chapter 3, the question. The first day of school was always a get acquainted day. Books were passed out, and there was a lot of chatter. Everyone asks, "What did you do over the summer?" Periods 1 through 6 went by very smoothly for Nick. But then came period 7. Mrs. Granger's class was all business. The first thing they did was take a vocabulary pretest to see how many of the 35 words for the week the kids already knew. Tremble, circular, orchestra. The list went on and on. Nick knew most of them. Then there was a handout about class procedures. After that, there was a review paper about cursive writing. Then there was a sample sheet showing how the heading should look on every assignment. No let up for 37 minutes straight. Nick was an expert at asking the delaying question, also known as the teacher stopper, or the guaranteed time waster. About 3 minutes before the bell, in that split second between the end of today's classwork and the announcement of tomorrow's homework, Nick could launch a question guaranteed to sidetrack the teacher long enough to delay or even wipe out the homework assignment. Timing was important, but asking the right question, that was the hard part. Questions about stuff in the news, questions about college, about the college the teacher went to, questions about the teacher's favorite book or sport or hobby. Nick knew all the tricks, and he had been very successful in the past. Here he was in 5th grade near the end of his very first language arts class with Mrs. Granger, and Nick could feel a homework assignment coming the way a farmer can feel a rainstorm. Mrs. Granger paused to catch her breath, and Nick's hand shot up. She glanced down at her seating chart and then back up at him. Her sharp gray eyes were not even turned up half power. "Yes, Nicholas?" "Mrs. Granger, you have so many dictionaries in this room, and that huge one especially. Where did all the words come from? Did they just get copied from other dictionaries? It sure is a big book." It was the perfect thought grenade. Kapow! Several kids smiled, and a few of them peeked at the clock. Nick was famous for this, and the whole class knew what he was doing. Unfortunately, so did Mrs. Granger. She hesitated for a moment and gave Nick a smile that was just a little too sweet to be real. Her eyes were the color of a thundercloud. "Why, what an interesting question, Nicholas. I could talk about that for a few hours, I bet." She glanced around the classroom. "Do the rest of you want to know too?" Everyone nodded yes. "Very well, Nicholas. Will you do some research on that subject and give a little oral report to the class? If you find out the answer to yourself, it will mean so much more than if I just told you. Please have your report ready by next class." Mrs. Granger smiled at him again, very sweetly. Then it was back to business. "Now, the homework for tomorrow can be found on the page 12 of your Words Alive book." Nick barely heard the assignment. His heart was pounding. He felt small, very small. He could feel the tops of his ears glowing red. A complete shutdown, an extra assignment, and probably a little black mark next to his name on the seating chart. Everything he had heard about this teacher was true. Don't mess around with the lone Granger. All right, friends, that is the end of our first mini lesson. So, what I want you to do is go into Google Classroom and navigate down to the assignment, very similar to the coronavirus assignment that we completed last week. It's going to be very similar to that, and I'm very, very happy that everyone completed it for the most part, and it looked fantastic. So work on that and let me know if you have any questions. I will be available in office hours every day this week from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. And make sure that you're checking your email. As always, if you need extra work, you can go on to Read Theory, IXL, RazKids, Epic, um, any of those platforms you have access to. I don't really know why I just said IXL because IXL doesn't have language arts, but you know what I mean. So again, yeah, thanks so much. And I will have a new video Wednesday. Can't wait to see you all. Bye.